All right, so daylight saving time, huh? It's one of those things, right? We all know about it. We do it twice a year. But how many of us really understand the history behind it or why it's so debated?
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating, actually, the whole story of DST.
So let's dive into it. We're going to be looking at excerpts from, you guessed it, the Wikipedia article on daylight saving time, trying to get to the bottom of this whole time-shifting saga.
You know, what's interesting is that we often think about, like, changing the clocks twice a year as a modern invention.
Right, for sure.
But the concept of, like, adjusting your schedules to kind of make the most of daylight goes way back.
Oh, really? Like, are we talking ancient sundials and stuff?
Not quite sundials, but think
Oh.
about the ancient Romans.
Okay.
They divided daylight into 12 hours regardless of the season, so that meant that their hours were longer in the summer and shorter in the winter.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah.
That kind of blew my mind a little bit because our concept of time is so rigid compared to that, you know?
Exactly. And we even see this reflected in Roman water clocks, which had different scales for different months, to account for the varying lengths of daylight hours.
Wow. That's so cool. So they didn't change their clocks. They changed the length of an hour.
Right.
Fascinating. Okay, but what about like Benjamin Franklin? Wasn't he the early to bed, early to rise guy?
Yes, the famous, letter about the Parisians wasting daylight.
Right, right.
That's often cited as like an early example of DST thinking, but it was actually satire.
Oh.
He was suggesting they wake everyone up earlier to save on candles.
Okay.
He wasn't actually proposing like shifting the clock.
Okay, so more of a commentary on making the most of daylight, not true DST.
Got it.
So who actually came up with this whole time-shifting thing? Like, who was the first to say, hey, let's mess with the clocks?
Well, the first like really detailed proposal came from a New Zealand entomologist named George Hudson back in 1895. He worked shifts collecting bugs and wanted more daylight after work. So basically proposed a 2-hour time jump, all for, bug hunting.
2 hours. That's some serious dedication to entomology.
Yeah.
So what about William Willett? He's the guy everyone credits with inventing DST, right?
Yeah, so Willett independently proposed the idea in 1907 in England.
Okay.
And he was an avid golfer, wanted more daylight for his evening rounds.
Oh, of course.
And King Edward VII actually even liked the idea. So you could say the golf was like a major driving force behind early DST.
Wow, it's amazing how these personal passions can sometimes lead to huge changes, But who actually put DST into practice first? Like, who was the first to actually change their clocks?
Well, you might be surprised to learn that it was Port Arthur, Ontario in 1908.
Canada. Really?
Yeah.
And would have guessed that.
It is kind of a surprise. Shortly after, Germany and its allies adopted DST during World War I, primarily to conserve coal. A lot of other countries then followed suit. The U.S. also adopted it in 1918, but then repealed it after the war.
Really?
Even though President Wilson, who funnily enough was also an avid golfer, he vetoed the repeal twice.
Wow.
Mm.
He really wanted that extra time on the golf course. It seems like DST has always been a bit controversial, though, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
So, in your opinion, why do you think it's sparked so much debate throughout history?
Well, I think it boils down to, like, how it affects different groups in society.
Right.
Some have benefited while others have found it pretty disruptive.
Yeah, it gets any big change like that, it's going to have winners and losers. So who are the big winners in the DST game and who wasn't so happy about it?
Well, retailers, for example, they often favored DST.
Yeah.
More daylight in the evening, more shopping time. Back in 1918, there was even a DST bill that had the backing of, get this, United Cigar Stores.
Oh, wow. I can see why they'd be on board.
Yeah.
Longer summer evenings, more time to spend money. But who wasn't so thrilled about DST?
Well, farmers have historically been one of the strongest opponents. Their work is really tied to the sun, not the clock.
Right.
Shifting the clock messed with their schedules and their livestock routines.
Yeah, cows don't really care about daylight saving time. So it's like DST creates this conflict between human-made time and the natural rhythms that govern so much of life.
Exactly. It's a great example of how a simple change can have like ripple effects across society.
For sure.
And it's not just farmers. You think about the evening entertainment industry, like movie theaters.
Uh-huh.
They weren't always thrilled with DST because people might be less inclined to, go out when it's still light out.
Interesting. So it's like more daylight hours for some meant potential losses for others. How did DST play out globally? Did it catch on everywhere?
So after World War I, its use actually declined.
Really?
Yeah, but then it had a comeback during World War II.
Ah,
And the U.S. standardized it in 1966 with the Uniform Time Act. Then the 1970s energy crisis really cemented its use as countries were looking for ways to conserve energy.
it's really interesting how DST has been kind of intertwined with these major global events,
Yeah.
but we know it's not without its critics. What are some other groups that have found DST to be problematic?
Well, it's easy to forget that time is also tied to religious practices.
Well, that's a good point.
And DST has presented challenges for some religious communities. For example, Muslims observing Ramadan, or Jewish communities, especially in Israel, around certain holidays, their daily rituals and prayer times are determined by the sun.
Right.
And DST, throws a wrench in that.
Wow, I hadn't even considered that. It's like DST is creating these clashes, not just with natural rhythms, but with cultural and religious practices too.
Wow.
Seems like this simple idea of changing the clock has all sorts of unintended consequences.
Yeah, for sure. It raises a lot of interesting questions about whose needs and values are being prioritized when we make these kind of decisions about time. And then on top of that, think about all the complexities with time differences across regions because of varying DST rules and dates.
Right.
Some places observe it, some don't. The start and end dates are all over the place.
Yeah, it's a total mess.
Yeah.
It sounds like DST is this like tangled web of history, science, social impacts, and even religious considerations. It's way more than just spring forward, fall back. That's for sure.
Oh, absolutely. It goes way deeper. And that leads us to the big question. What are the actual, real world effects of this clock changing ritual? Have we really benefited from it?
Okay, so we've talked about the history of daylight saving time and how it's affected different groups, but now let's get to the heart of it. Has DST actually done what it was supposed to do?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Does it actually work?
Exactly. So let's start with the whole energy savings thing. Was DST really the energy saving superhero it was made out to be?
Well, it's complicated, right? Because the idea is that DST reduces energy consumption because people use less artificial light in the evenings.
Right. Makes sense on the surface.
Yeah, it sounds pretty logical. But the research is a little more nuanced, I guess you could say.
So it's not as straightforward as more daylight equals less energy use.
Right. Some studies have shown, small reductions in energy use, but others have found no significant impact or even slight increases in consumption.
Really? So more daylight can actually lead to more energy use in some cases.
Yeah, it seems like things like climate, geography, and even people's behavior all kind of play a role.
Okay, so can you give us an example of those conflicting findings?
Sure. There was a study in Indiana back in 2008 that actually found a 1% increase in residential electricity consumption after the state adopted DST.
Wow.
They concluded that while lighting demand decreased, the use of other appliances like air conditioners actually increased, so it kind of offset any savings.
That makes sense. You crank up the AC when it's hot, even if it's still light out.
Exactly. But then, there was another study in California that found that DST did lead to a small reduction in electricity use, especially during those peak evening hours.
Okay, so different regions, different climates, different results. It's not a slam dunk for the energy saving argument then. What about the impact on our health? I've heard DST can mess with sleep and even increase the risk of heart attacks.
Yeah, that's another area where there's pretty strong evidence, actually. Shifting the clock, even by an hour, can disrupt our circadian rhythm.
Your circadian rhythms?
Yeah, that internal clock that regulates our sleep-wake cycle. It's kind of like giving our bodies a mini case of jet lag twice a year.
Oh, jet lag is the worst. I feel totally out of it for days.
Right. And those DST transitions have been linked to increased risk of heart attacks, strokes, even workplace accidents in the days after the time change.
Seriously. So it's are those extra daylight hours really worth those potential risks? I mean, are people starting to rethink DST because of all this?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's a growing movement to just get rid of the back and forth altogether. Some people want to just stay on DST year-round, while others prefer to stick with standard time. It's a hot topic all over the world these days.
So are there any places that have already ditched the time switch?
For sure. Argentina, Belarus, and some parts of Canada, for example, have gone with year-round DST.
So they just said, forget it, we're staying on summertime.
Basically, they figured, why bother with the disruption and the potential health risks if they can just enjoy those longer summer evenings all year round?
Yeah, I could see the appeal. But I remember you mentioned there might be some downsides to permanent DST too.
Right. The biggest concern is those really late sunrises in the winter. Imagine waking up for work or school in the dark for months.
Ugh, yeah, not fun.
It can really affect people's moods, and it can even be a safety issue, especially in places that already have short winter days.
Okay, so later sunsets in the summer, but darker mornings in the winter. It's a tough call.
Hmm.
What about the U.S.? Have we thought about making a change?
Well, we've kind of flirted with the idea of permanent DST a few times.
Okay.
Senator Rubio has been pushing for it, introducing bills to make it happen.
Hmm.
One of them even passed the Senate in 2022, but it kind of stalled in the House.
Wow, so close. Why didn't it go through?
It seems like there's still a lot of debate about whether permanent DST or permanent standard time would be best.
Right, right.
Some people are worried about those dark winter mornings for kids going to school, people commuting. Others argue that the benefits of longer daylight hours, like reduced crime and more outdoor recreation time, outweigh the risks.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's interesting how a simple question like, should we change the clocks, can be so complex.
For sure, it really shows how something we take for granted, like time, is actually tied to social norms, economics, health concerns, and even our relationship with nature.
So it seems like we're kind of at this crossroads with daylight saving time, right?
Yeah, we've explored the history, the impacts, even some potential health consequences.
Right, exactly. But what's the next step? Is there like some magic solution that'll make everyone happy?
Well, that's the tricky part, finding a balance, right? You got to weigh all those different interests and values when you're talking about time.
So some places have gone all in on either permanent DST or standard time. Any lessons we can take from their experience?
Oh, definitely. There are some interesting cases out there. Take Arizona, for instance. They just opted out of DST completely. They're on standard time year-round.
Right, I've heard about that. Why'd they do that?
Well, Arizona, it's a hot desert state.
Yeah.
Those long summer days with DST just meant more brutal heat in the evenings. They found sticking with standard time helped, cut back on some of that extreme heat, especially when energy use is at its peak.
Makes sense. Prioritizing climate over those extra daylight hours. What about the places that went for permanent DST? How's that working out?
It's a mixed bag, really. Some places like Saskatchewan seem pretty happy with it. They really like those longer evenings, especially during those loon winter months.
Yeah.
But even there, some people aren't thrilled about those dark winter mornings.
Yeah, that seems to be the big sticking point for a lot of folks. Any ideas out there to, address that issue?
There are some ideas floating around. Some people have suggested like shifting school and work schedules
Oh,
to better match the natural light patterns in winter. Others have even talked about more localized approaches to time.
oh, interesting.
Like different communities could set their clocks based on their own specific needs and preferences.
That's pretty cool, actually. And it seems like with all the remote work and flexible schedules these days, we might be heading towards a more personalized approach to time anyway. Maybe the future isn't about these huge changes like DST, but more about individual choice and flexibility.
It's definitely a possibility, and that's what makes this whole conversation about time so fascinating, right? It makes us rethink how we structure our lives, how we interact with nature, and which values we prioritize.
You've given me a lot to think about, for sure. So, to wrap things up, what's the big takeaway you want listeners to leave with today?
I'd say the most important thing is remembering that time isn't just this neutral thing,
Mm-hmm.
It's something we created, a social construct, and it's constantly changing based on our needs, our values, even technology.
That's a great point. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive into daylight saving time. It's been really eye-opening.
My pleasure. Always happy to chat about time.
And that's a wrap for this episode of The Deep Dive. We hope you enjoyed this exploration of daylight saving time. It's a lot more complex than it seems. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.